Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Well, here we are near the end of October, so it's Halloween coming up, so I thought it would maybe be fun to tell some ghost stories. Well, yeah. So I've selected a few stories from the Petawatu, the Tales of the Departed. This is a short book in the Pali Canon that's written entirely in verse. This is similar in that sense to the Jatakas. The stories are from the commentaries and they're expansions on the verse. So the stories make up the bulk of what printed text. So to begin with, tell the story of the king of Surat, who lived sometime after the Buddha's departure, and he was returning with his army from a military expedition, and on their way back home, they took what they thought was a shortcut. They took a wrong road. And the king, looking ahead, he said, "This is a delightful road. It looks well watered, the beautiful trees, flowers abounding everywhere. Let's continue on this road." One of his advisors was wiser than him and thought, something wrong with this road. The wind has a sound like an inhuman cry, and there's a foul smell about. And then he looked around behind him and his hair stood on end, because the land they had just went over was not fair, pleasant, green land, but a dark, dismal swamp. And he alerted the king, "Your Majesty, we have stumbled into the realm of the Petas. This is an unearthly place." And the king looked around and he saw the same thing. And now all the greenery and everything disappeared, and they were surrounded by this dark, dismal swamp. And they went on for days like this, and the army became scattered, and they were running low on supplies. And after some time, it was only the king and his advisor that were together. And they'd lost all the rest of the army and dissipated away in different directions. And they were on the verge of starvation and dying of thirst. And they saw in the distance a green, what looked like a green mountain. And the king said, "Let's go towards that mountain." And as they approached, they saw it wasn't a mountain at all, but a monstrously huge banyan tree. And when they came close to the tree, a man dressed in resplendent robes covered in jewels and gems, dressed like a high-born nobleman, he came out from the branches of the tree and greeted them courteously, and with a snap of his finger materialized a table laden with food and drink and everything needful. And they sat and refreshed themselves, and they asked this mysterious person to tell his story. And he said that he had been a merchant in a nearby town, but he had been greedy and miserly and cruel, and he had never given to beggars, and he'd abused his neighbors, and he cheated in his dealings. And so when he died, he was to spend 500 years as a miserable Peta, and then he would fall to the lowest hell. But his daughter was a good, pious, and virtuous young woman, and after his death, she made merit, giving alms to the bhikkhus when they came through, and always dedicating the merit to her father. So by the power of this dedicated merit, he had this comfortable existence. But he said, alas, when 500 years is expired, there's no saving me. I shall then fall to the lowest hell, and there burn in the iron room of a Vichy hell, blazing with flames. And his daughter had just bought him a respite with her merit. So that this astonished and appalled the king, and he made a vow to always keep the precepts and be virtuous in the future. And the Peta showed him the road, the proper road to take to escape from this Peta realm. And after some further wanderings, he returned to his own kingdom, and then he ruled righteously thereafter. There's another story about a man named Mata Windaka who lived in modest circumstances with his mother and father. And when his father died, he left behind him a small inheritance. And Mata Windaka thought that he would like to take this money and buy some goods and take to sea as a merchant and increase his wealth. But his mother opposed this plan. She said, "We have little enough as it is. We don't wish to risk our whole family fortune. And plus, if you're lost at sea, then what's to become of me?" And they quarreled about it. And this went on for some time. And in the end, Mata Windaka decided to ignore the wishes of his mother. And they had one last scene where she begged and implored him to stay, and he grew angry and he struck her down with a blow with his fist, and she fell to the floor. And not stopping to see whether she was alive or dead, he left the house with the wealth of the family in a sack, and he went down to the docks and took a passage on a ship to Sawanabhumi, the Golden Land. It's probably Southeast Asia. It was always the sought-after land of wealth and opportunity for Indian merchants. There's many stories about voyages to Sawanabhumi, and usually they end in shipwreck or disaster of some kind or another. I don't think the ancient Indians were very good mariners. In any case, Mata Windaka got on board the ship, and when they had made about half the passage, they were caught in a calm, which in the days of sailing ships, this was one of the possible dangers of going to sea. The winds would fail and the ship would just sit there. And after many days of just sitting in the calm, the sailors said there must be a jinx aboard the ship. And they drew lots to see who was the person who had the evil karma that was causing this calm. And the lot fell on Mata Windaka, so they threw him overboard. And immediately he was off the ship. The wind blew up and the ship sailed away merrily and leaves the story. Mata Windaka, hanging onto a plank of wood, survives for a day, and then he saw an island in the distance. And he paddled to get to the island and came ashore on the island. There was a crystal palace, and inside were 4 maidens of unearthly beauty. And they took him in and tended to him and looked after him and gave him all needful things, and he enjoyed sensual pleasures for 7 days. And then all the maidens turned into ugly, ferocious petas. And he immediately got back on his plank and paddled out, paddled back out to sea. And in another day he came to another island, and this one had a palace of silver and 8 maidens. And the same thing happened as before. After 7 days of enjoying pleasures, they turned into horrible monsters and paddled away. Then he came to another island that had a palace of gold and 16 maidens. You guess what happened? And then the final one was an island with a palace of gems and 32 maidens. And again, in 7 days, they turned into ferocious, ugly petas. These women
were what are called Vamanapetas. They're beings who, with mixed karma, enjoy for part of the time they enjoy sense pleasures, and for part of the time they experience misery as a peta, because they did good deeds and bad deeds mixed, and this is one possible outcome, possible rebirth is a Vamana-peta. So now Mata-Windika paddling out to sea for the last time, and he came now to a very broad landscape, and he saw a golden city on a hill, and he thought, this looks paradisical. I'm going to go here and settle here, and perhaps I can make myself king of the place. And he walked inshore for a little while, and he saw standing there a man wearing on his head a wreath of beautiful lotus flowers. And the man was singing sweetly. But the reality is all this was a false perception, that he'd actually come to Usada hell, Usada Naraya, one of the iron hells. And this man was not singing sweetly, he was moaning in pain. And the lotus flowers was actually a wreath of razor wheels digging into his head. Well, Mata-Windika then challenged this man. He said, "Good sir, you've worn those lotus flowers long enough. Give them to me." And the man said, "These are not lotus flowers, they're razor wheels." He says, "You lie. You just wish to keep them for yourself. Hand them over." So then the fellow thought, it must be that my karma has come to an end. Perhaps this fellow has abused his mother just as I did. And then he took off his razor wheel and handed it to put it on the head of Mata-Windika, and immediately his perception cleared, and he saw he was wearing razor wheels digging into his head, and he was in a horrible dark hell full of flames and smoke. And he called out, take these back, but the man was gone, and that was the end of Mata-Windika. Yeah. Now, third story, just a short anecdote really. The Arahant monk Samkicha was walking once with one of his disciples, and they saw a procession of unearthly beings going from south to north. At the head of the procession, riding on a white elephant, was a young man, gorgeously dressed, very handsome and noble in appearance. And behind him was another similar figure riding in a chariot pulled by 4 white horses. And behind that was a very beautiful young woman dressed in finery, being carried in a golden litter. And behind that there were 2 ugly creatures, dark, deformed, gnarly, each carrying a big heavy mallet. And as they walked along, they were striking each other with the mallets, and that would open wounds from which blood and pus oozed out, and they would greedily lick and suck at the wounds because of their great hunger and thirst. And the disciple asked Samkicha, "What on earth are we seeing here?" And Samkicha told him, "These 5 were a family. The 2 at the back were mother and father, but they were evil-minded and quarrelsome. And the 3 at the front were the children, and they were good and virtuous. And at one time there was a terrible storm, and the house they were in was old, and some of the timbers were decayed, and the house collapsed and killed them all. And now they exist, 3 of them as Bhumadevas and 2 as miserable Petas. And they're going now to an assembly of yakas in the Himavant." Sometimes it'd be these, perhaps still are, assemblies of all these beings in the Himavant, in the far north, in the mountains. They would come, all these kinds of beings would come for the great assembly. The last story that I picked out involves a group of people, 500 couples, so 1,000 altogether, that had formed a society or gotten together to make merit. And the men would give some of their wealth to their wives, and the wives would travel around to monasteries and make offerings. And on one of these journeys, one of the women, while they were staying overnight at an inn, she was seduced by some scoundrel and spent the night with this rogue, committed adultery on her husband. And the word got back to the husband, and he accused his wife of cheating on him. And she said, "If I have betrayed you, then in my next life may I be devoured by a crop-eared dog like this one." So the little dog they had there, she's pointing at. And the husband was somewhat mollified, but he made inquiries amongst the other women, and they all said the same. They said, "She's innocent. She did nothing. If I'm lying, may I be reborn as a slave." So when time passed and this woman died, she was reborn. She became a Wamanapetta because of her many good deeds. She was reborn in a gorgeous mansion by a lotus pond up in the Himawa. And one by one, her companions, the other 500 women, or 499 women, they all died and were reborn in the same place as her slaves. So she was attended by all these servants as handmaidens, and she lived in this gorgeous mansion. But every night after sundown, she felt compelled to go outside and stand by the lotus pond. And then this enormous black dog would creep out of the bushes and tear her to shreds and devour her until nothing was left but a skeleton. And with his snout, he'd push the bones into the lotus pond. And just before sunrise, the bones would reassemble and she'd become whole again. And she'd go back into the palace. So by day, she enjoyed sensual pleasures and ease and comfort. And by night, she was devoured by this dog. And it came to pass after she had been in this place for more than 500 years that a prince from one of the Indian kingdoms was hunting in the Himavant, and he came across her palace. And she invited him in, and they fell in love, and he lived with her, and they lived as husband and wife. And by the magic of the place, his own life was extended. He seemed to be ever youthful, and 150 years passed, and he always wondered where she went at night. She told him not to follow her. Don't pay any attention to where I go at night. And he seemed to put up with this arrangement for a long time. It was like 150 years, and then he got curious. So where does she go every night? And he followed her, and he saw what happened. And so then he armed himself, and the next night he went out and he shot the dog with a poison arrow and freed her from the curse. And they lived the rest of their days there in happiness in their palace by the lotus pond. So these are 4 tales from the Petawatu, and I think may be suitable fare for Halloween. Okay.